Hello. Earlier today I got a chance to see the Gladiator II film in the cinema, so I thought I'd post a little video with my thoughts on the history behind it, the background. So although I was planning to release this morning a video about Thermopylae on screen that looks at the movie 300 and the 300 Spartans from the 1960s, we'll postpone that. I've already edited it up, it's all ready, it's all loaded up to the site. That'll come out on the weekend instead, so you'll get two videos this week, both cinema related. But I thought I'd talk about Gladiator. I don't want to do a whole, what do they call it on YouTube, historian reacts to and all this sort of stuff. I don't know, there's just something a little bit odd about a lot of the phraseology that people use for some of these things. And I certainly don't want to do a hatchet job and just say this is wrong, oh, it's terrible, they should have done all this sort of thing. However, I think all of us who are interested in the ancient world are always pleased, excited, slightly nervous, perhaps more than slightly nervous, when something is released on screen that's set in our period, and it's worth talking about. Now, I'll also be very careful because I realise that although it's been out in the US and elsewhere for quite a while, it's only been in Britain for 10 days or so. It's taken me a long time to get to see it. It's just been one of those things where it hasn't worked out with various other commitments. And ended up going at a rather odd time, a showing that started at noon earlier today. Though there was surprisingly, there were about 10 or 12 people in the cinema, which for that time of day, even on a rainy day, you felt, that's not bad going. But you never quite know these days. Many films don't stay in the cinemas for that long, and then they'll be coming out on streaming. So I'm concerned, obviously, that people may not have seen it yet, but may want to. So I don't think there'll be any serious spoilers. I won't give away the plot in any detail. I really just want to talk about the setting, the look of the thing, and there's some quite nice things in there. There's some others where, yes, this is not likely to have been too close to the facts, shall we say. But so I don't think there'll be anything today that would spoil it for you if you haven't seen it yet. And I'm not going to reveal what happens to the main cast or anything like that. Is it worth going to see? Yes, I think it is. It's good fun, it's a good piece of cinema, it's spectacular. We'll come back to that at the end, but for the moment let's just talk about the history and the setting. Obviously it's 30 odd years since the original Russell Crowe Gladiator movie came out. There are a few clips of that, there are flashbacks using that, so Russell Crowe does pop up in the film and you see some of the scenes from that. This one is set, when it opens and you get the credits, you have a sort of cartoony, painted style synopsis, really, of the story so far of what happened in Gladiator. And then it comes up to say it's 16 years after the death of Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius dies in 180, that would take us up to 196. It then flicks on to another screen that tells us it's 8200, so we've jumped on another 4 years. It's not something to worry about, it reassures me, because every time I get a new copy of a book, the first time I see it, I always spot a typo, something I've missed, some continuity thing that I've missed, the editors have missed, the friends who read the manuscripts for me have missed, and it's still there. So I have great sympathy. This thing happens. It doesn't cause any real problems. In terms of history, this is, as it comes back to that analogy, it's rather like a Western. It has a setting that was historical reality. There was a Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. There were emperors like Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, the main villain of the earlier film, and Caracalla and Geta that we'll see in this one. But it's not a history lesson, and it isn't meant to be a history lesson or a documentary or anything like that. That is very clearly not on their minds right from the start. And while that, it's similar to, say, the Ridley Scott Napoleon film from last year, it's got about the same level of close attention to actual events, chronology, all this sort of thing. This is, as far as the makers are concerned, I imagine it's more about spirit, setting, it's having a Roman flavour. And frankly, in plot terms, there are elements where it is rather reminiscent of Greek and Latin novels from the era and before, where people don't realise what their true identity is and nobody recognises everybody else, even though you feel they ought to, and they go through all sorts of perils that will get them killed and somehow survive. So you could say there's something of the spirit of that in it, but it's a Western like The Magnificent Seven or something like that. That's a great film, but it's not necessarily too closely tied to reality, and it isn't meant to be. This is entertainment. It's meant to be spectacular. It's meant to be exotic, take you to a different world that they've created for the benefit of this film, and I think it does all of those things, but it isn't one where history gets in the way of a good story, so as far as they're concerned. So they're not terribly worried about this. Mentioned already that the main, the emperors really of the story are Caracalla and Geta, who are described as twins, which I don't think they were. I think there was a year or two between them. Now they're the sons of Septimius Severus. He becomes emperor, he proclaims himself emperor after the murder of Pertinax in 193. That's after Commodus has been murdered, not killed by Russell Crowe in the Colosseum, but murdered in a palace conspiracy. And Pertinax, the freedman, the son of a slave, and former school teacher, is made emperor, but he only lasts 3 months because he doesn't pay the Praetorian Guard the money he'd promised them, partly because he's very low on cash. Again, fascinating story, a great figure to have. Nobody, as far as I know, has ever really done anything fictional about him, but there's a lot of interesting and exotic and strange stuff going on in this period. Severus is one of 3 governors, the other one's in Britain, the other one's in Syria. Severus is in Pannonia on the Danube, proclaims himself emperor because they're the men with the big armies. So they fight a civil war, but Severus is rather smart. He trades off the other 2, so he does an alliance with the fella in Britain to go and beat the one in Syria, and then later on rats on the one from Britain, and by 197 he's sole emperor. But it's taken 4 years. It's much longer as a civil war than the one that followed the death of Nero. But it's the only full-scale civil war since then, so it shows how pretty stable the empire has been. Severus then rules until February 211 AD and dies in York, and names his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, as his heirs. Septimius Severus doesn't get a mention in the film. He's not there, which is a pity. He's from North Africa, so he's famous as the African emperor, and his wife, Julia Domna, the mother of Caracalla and Geta, is from Syria. So they are Romans, they are Roman aristocrats, but nevertheless that's quite interesting. And there's the famous picture of the family that emphasizes the slightly exotic look of them. So in many ways you almost feel it would have been quite nice to have Denzil Washington playing Septimius Severus and base a story around that and his rise to power. But that's not the way they're going. This isn't about civil wars and big battles and power struggles and politics in a detailed sense. There's a political undertone to it all that helps to drive the plot, but it's never developed to make it too complicated. It's basically to keep the action going and give a reason for the twists and turns that occur. So it's slightly odd that Severus doesn't get a mention, but it does mean that chronologically, whether we're 196 or 8200, we're completely out of things. Caracalla and Geta don't become emperors until 211. Their father dies in York in northern Britain. They're proclaimed emperors there. Severus is supposed to have died with these rather chilling words of advice to his sons. It's love one another or live in harmony, indulge the soldiers, despise everyone else. And, they don't go down in history as terribly popular. They also didn't like each other. Here they're presented as pretty much off the rails, pretty loopy. One in particular, I must confess, one problem I did have watching the film that will no doubt come later when I see it again, when it's finally out on disc and all that sort of thing, is that I did struggle to tell Caracalla and Geta apart. They've made them look very similar. They've got these, I don't know if it's supposed to be dyed hair or wigs, but they're little ginger, reddish hair, rather pale makeup, look completely crazy, basically. I mean, they are channeling the Joaquin Phoenix Commodus. It's the same sort of loopy emperor that you've got from Caligula and I Claudius and all this sort of thing, and they're fine at doing that. That's clearly what there's. But they're not really developed very much as characters, particularly early on. You always see them together. Whereas in fact, the love one another or the live in harmony, however you choose to translate it, that Severus advised them to do as joined emperors, that didn't last. Within a year, Caracalla had murdered Geta, and Geta suffered damnatio memoriae, so his name was formally damned, his memory expunged from the record throughout the Roman Empire. And if you look at this inscription from the legionary fortress at Caerleon of Second Augusta, you can actually see where Geta's name was chiselled out. And you can just faintly, I've outlined it in black, you can see where the letters were. So it shows how thorough it was, and there are lots of inscriptions from all the way around the empire where this happened. So Caracalla did not like his brother, and supposed to have murdered him when Geta was in the arms of seeking refuge with her mother, and she spattered with his blood and all this sort of thing. So it's all very gruesome stuff. It's all very, very I Claudius, very palace conspiracy. Not really how the film does things. They're sort of presented as actually loopy, deranged, bad rulers. They're only interested in conquest and games in the amphitheatre and blood and guts and all that sort of thing, and they're not worried about, there's a bit where Pedro Pascal talks about the need to feed the population, and they're not bothered by that. They just want to, let's just give them blood and entertainment and victory, and they'll be fine. They don't need food. So they are the bad emperors set up to have, to obviously provoke our main characters to try and do better, try and do the right thing, try and change. There's a lot of going back to the the vision of Marcus Aurelius, Richard Harris in the original, and a better Rome, and vague talk of restoring the power of the Senate, restoring a republic, all this sort of thing. There's my longer video on Gladiator, the original one, that talks about how this doesn't really work. There are quite a lot of Roman stereotypes and cliches, or at least on-screen Roman stereotypes in this. So the Pedro Pascal character, who's married to Lucilla, Connie Nielsen, the actress from the original. She's one of the few who actually returns in this. In fact, no, there's Derek Jacobi as well, but I'm not sure whether anybody else actually who's in the original comes back in this one. With Derek Jacobi, because of I Claudius, where he played an elderly version of himself, I'm always a bit surprised. You forget that he's not actually as old as some of the characters he played early on in his career. So it was a bit of a surprise, but he's in it, which was nice to see. You have the stereotype of the Pedro Pascal character being the soldier. Like the Russell Crowe character, he's very much the equivalent of that, who goes off, fights the wars, wins the victories, but is a decent man at heart. He's a very good soldier, great leader, but a decent man who doesn't want to be cruel, who resents the slaughter, doesn't like war, doesn't like battle, feels they should only be fought when absolutely necessary to protect yourselves, this sort of thing. So, a decent man trying to do the right thing in a difficult, imperfect society. But of course, again, we've talked about this before, there isn't this separation between senators and soldiers. To be an army commander at this period, you are still going to be a senator. It's changed a little bit in Marcus Aurelius's reign, in the aftermath of the Great Plagues, where they're short of suitable candidates to command armies. So there are a few people who begin to have more military careers than would have been the case in the past, but even they, Pertinax is an example of this, don't have exclusively military careers. So that's rather artificial. Again, the division between Senate and people. Talk about, at one point, I think it's Macrinus, the Denzil Washington character, talks about, somebody says, I think you're going to stand for the election to the Senate. Well, you don't get elected to the Senate by this time. You might get elected magistrate, but you've always been enrolled in the Senate by the censors, and the censor is now the emperor who controls all of this. So it's slightly artificial. The Senate's there when it meets. It's a typical on-screen Senate. If there's about 50-odd people in it, and they're mostly very old. There aren't the young senators that there would have been, and there's not the 600 or so. Though again, in the imperial period, a lot of these people would be off on service, commanding legions, commanding armies. It's not quite clear. I think when Pedro Pascal appears at the start, he's commanding Legio III Augusta. They don't say that, but that's what they've got on the vexilla flags and elsewhere. And he's fighting in North Africa, so presumably he's governor of Numidia. But again, that's a governor of a province that only has a single legion in it, plus auxiliaries. So he's not one of the really big ones like Britain. Britain's now divided into the two Pannonias, or like Syria is sort of the last really big one, although Severus has created other provinces in the area. And of course you've got Judea, or Syria Palestina as it is by now, has turned into a bigger 2-legion province by this stage. Anyway, that's wandering off the point. So there are a lot of the cliches of what we expect, as we're getting, of course, gladiatorial games and all this sort of thing. Plot-wise, the story starts with a big battle, or rather an assault on a fortified city that's carried out by a fleet of ships that have siege towers and siege engines mounted on them. This is supposed to be the last free city in Numidia. I mean, it's all fictional stuff, but it's quite an impressive opening battle. I suppose it's a counterpart, really, to the battle against the Germans that you have in the woodland at the start of Gladiator. It's, you know, it's not bad. It has aspects of some of the scenes from Kingdom of Heaven, this sort of thing, the assaults on Jerusalem there. There's even a line that Paul Mescal delivers that is very similar to one Orlando Bloom delivers in that film, but, you know, fair enough. Paul Mescal's story is set up very, very quickly. I mean, it's one of the problems that this is a sequel that, you know, he gets, whereas Russell Crowe gets sort of half an hour or so of being, yes, he fights in a battle, but basically he's honoured, he's important. You see him as the army leader, the man of distinction. You don't get that. Paul Mescal has only a few minutes of a happy family and feeding his chickens before everything goes horribly wrong and the Romans arrive. This is not... There's no history behind this. There isn't some last free city in Numidia that the Romans conquer at this time. However, there were cases where you mounted assaults from galleys, from old warships, so that's interesting to see. I suppose there's been a bit in the Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny, the flashback to Syracuse. They've done a little bit of that. This does it rather better, I think, because that's obviously a bigger thing in the film. Couple of nice things. When you look at the Roman troops, they're mostly legionaries on board the ships. The kit's pretty good. You know, there's some decent, you see the Hebron helmet or a copy of it, you see some of the later 2nd, 3rd century ones. A nice touch as well is that while most of the legionaries have Lorica segmentata, the banded armour, there are a few in mail, which we tend to think is, you know, these days we think is likely, and that's quite nice. They're centurions with very clear transverse crests. I mean, most of them have got the medals on the harness over their cuirass. They actually look the part. I mean, it's pretty good. It's closer than the original. There are still moments where you have to squint a bit and not look too closely, but nevertheless this is quite nice. The look of the Roman troops, particularly of this 3rd Augusta Legion that will feature again later on in the story, again not actually named as such, but it's there, the titles, you see it on a few of the standards. They look pretty good. They're also one nice touch. It's one thing that's bothered me about a lot of epics in recent years, is that normally the shields are very drab. And yes, you might have all the thunderbolts and lightning and things like that on decoration, but they tend to have a drab, dark field. You know, they look like that. It adds to the sort of gloominess in the original Gladiator of that first battle that, okay, it's filmed in Britain as well, so its grey skies have helped you along with that, but it's supposed to be in this bleak waste, you know, wilderness of Germany that you're fighting. They've got red shields that are quite brightly painted, and that's nice. It's nice to see the Roman army looking colourful, looking bright, because again, you have leather shield covers that turn up more often than the shields themselves that are there to protect the design. Obviously, anything wear and tear on campaign is going to take its toll, but you look at the Jura Europus scutum, it's brightly coloured, and there is talk of Roman armies, you know, there's supposed to be, Plutarch tells a story that of Tigranes of Armenia being told, well, you can see the Romans are dressing up, they're putting on their crests, that means they're getting ready for battle. They're trying to look good, they're trying to show off, and Caesar mentions an occasion where an enemy attacks so suddenly that there isn't time to fix the crests on the helmet. Now obviously, as far as we can tell, they're not using crests quite so much by this period, that's 1st century BC, but I think the idea of dressing up, look impressive, look fancy, and intimidate the enemy by looking good is an important part of this. A lot of Roman military equipment, a lot of helmets, a lot of armour, is designed to be shiny, is designed to be gaudy. You know, you have the tinning effects and the gilding that you get on some helmets. Everything is making your shoulders look bigger. It's like 18th century Napoleonic uniform, you know, the saying in Napoleon's army, you can never be too well dressed to be a corpse. they want to make the soldiers feel good, feel impressive, and also look intimidating. So this is it's nice to see, because, as I say, there's been that trend in costumiers that Roman soldiers look rather drab and dark, and you still get the sort of black-clad, blackened armour Praetorians in this, though they look a bit more convincing than the ones in the original film. Again, helmets, the details of armour and things are a bit better. Not 100%, but they're a lot better. From the sort of, for on-screen, this is pretty good. So on the whole, I thought the kit was decent, and some of it was very nice indeed. The attack scene's quite well done. It's fairly simple. Once they actually drop down the ramp of the tower and get onto the wall, nobody actually takes their shields with them to fight. That's probably just for easier to make it choreograph the whole thing. You've got Pedro Pascal, who presumably is the legatus of the province and commander of the legion. He does the Russell Crowe stuff. He's charging around, chopping people up, doing all the heroic stuff. Maybe perhaps in an assault there are cases of this. In an ordinary battle you've got other things to do as commander, but again, for on screen it's what people expect, and it's fine, it works. And there are cases, Vespasian gets wounded in an assault during the Jewish rebellion. Titus almost gets cut off in another one during the siege of Jerusalem. So senior commanders can expose themselves, and they can fight sometimes in these circumstances. Probably less often sword in hand, though again there are descriptions of Titus doing this by the rather fawning Josephus, and another occasion where he shoots a bow and arrow and starts shooting at rebels. Anyway, so it's not a long thing, but it's the grand opening scene. It's quite well done. You have, in the aftermath, they're burying the dead, they're taking the prisoners away, all this sort of thing. Tragedies happen to Paul Mescal. There's lots of flags. I mean, it's not quite to the Napoleon degree where there are flags absolutely everywhere. And there were quite a lot in Gladiator originally. There are probably more flowing banners than is right, but again, it's colourful. It's, if they want to do that, fair enough. You then move on to the main plot. This is how Paul Mescal becomes a gladiator. He gets taken to Rome. You have a baboon fight where some of them are attacked by... It's slightly strange, very obviously CGI. There is confusion in this and in series like Those About to Die and others between public executions, where often there's they play out myths, they do things in a more exotic way, and people being thrown to the beast. So this is that situation where they appear to be trying to execute prisoners, although some of them, including Paul Mescal, obviously otherwise we wouldn't have much of a story, are spared and fight their way to, and they're recognised, and he's actually bought by Denzil Washington at this point. So, as I say, sorry, there's a few plot bits, but hopefully none of this is too critical to what goes on. So he then goes off to become a gladiator, and they go to Rome. They first of all fight in Antium, I think it's supposed to be, so sort of outside Rome. It looks very much like the same setting that they filmed the North African provincial gladiatorial scenes in Gladiator. It's very dusty, it's very dry. It's now supposed to be Italy, which doesn't quite convince, but again, isn't that big a deal. There's a very distinctly different look to Rome and all the sets in this film, in that the Rome of Gladiator, the original film, is very grey. And I think Ridley Scott talked about sort of Leni Riefenstahl and the Triumph of the Will and all those sort of National Socialist processions where it was grey with red banners and all this sort of thing. And he went for that look when Commodus comes into Rome. Now it's much more sandstone, it's much more paler, sandier, lighter. Truth is probably somewhere in between the two. It depends where it is, and a lot more buildings will be rendered. But it's fine. I'm not complaining about it. It struck me. It jumped out. It felt very different to the original film, but it actually lifted the visuals a little bit. I think in many ways it works a little better. And everything is very dusty, which, if you're set in Rome in the summer, is fair enough. So you have the whole story played out, and eventually they'll end up at the Colosseum, and you get an escalating series of gladiatorial fights in the Colosseum. The intrigue starts. Let's talk about Denzil Washington's character at this point. He's Macrinus, Opellius Macrinus. Marcus Opellius Macrinus was the original one. The real man was from Mauritania, so he's from North Africa, and source talks about him having at least one earring. Denzil Washington has two in this, but although he has the name, the character is significantly different from the historical one. The real chap was a Roman equestrian, did very well in imperial service, and became Praetorian prefect under Caracalla. Now, ultimately, again, this is the history, not the film, so I don't think there's any spoilers in talking about this. He's very successful under Caracalla, becomes very important, and Praetorian prefect by this time is much less of a military role. They have tended to assume a role as judicial advisor, as a senior jurist, and this will become the case as time goes on. They've become much more bureaucrat and administrator, partly financial, partly legal advisor to the emperor, even though they do nominally command, or there should normally be two of them commanding the Praetorian Guard of 9 cohorts plus cavalry. Whether the imperial horse guards, the Singulares Augusti, come under the same command is arguable. They probably don't. It's slightly separate as the emperor tries to cover himself. One thing Septimius Severus has done is raise 3 new legions, 1st, 2nd and 3rd Parthica, one of which, the second, is stationed at albeit, not too far from Rome itself. So you've actually gone from a Rome garrison of at most 10,000, even if the Praetorian cohort's double strength, to an army of 20,000 between the Praetorians, the legion, and the strong guard cavalry units of the Praetorian cavalry, but also the Singulares. So you've basically got the equivalent of a decent-sized provincial army at the emperor's immediate disposal. Severus had also dismissed the existing Praetorians and replaced them with the pick of his own men from Pannonia and elsewhere. So at least for a while you had far more soldiers with combat experience within the Praetorian Guard, so they're probably rather more efficient. And Severus spends a lot of his reign on campaign. He campaigns in the east against the Parthians. He campaigns in Britain. That's why he's up in York when he dies, against the Caledonian tribes in Scotland, and appears to be thinking of occupying fairly permanently more land up there, even though he's also restored Hadrian's Wall, and that occurs during his reign. So it's quite a different army. It's the Praetorians are probably better troops at this time, at least early on. But anyway, that's an aside. So Macrinus is in charge of these. You have an equestrian rather than a senator in charge of your guard, because you think, well, an equestrian can't have ambitions towards being emperor, therefore he's less of a threat. You put a senator in charge of an army that's keeping you secure on the throne, then that's really asking for trouble. By 217, when Caracalla has launched an expedition against the Parthians, he seems to provoke a war. He's got... Caracalla likes to see himself as a tough soldier, and you don't get that reflected in the Caracalla of the film. So while Dio and others talk about his evil temper, his tendency to go into a rage, and there's sources about his sexual proclivities and his, he sort of tries to rape a Vestal Virgin and all this sort of thing, has some unorthodox marriages, and but also may have had some physical problems that didn't really allow him to perform properly. Anyway, we can talk about Caracalla another day. He's obsessed with Alexander the Great. He was supposed to have formed a new unity called the Legion, or the Phalanx of Alexander the Great, all of very tall men equipped in what they thought was the Macedonian style, though the description suggests that they didn't quite get that right, given that you're 500 years after Alexander, so it's not particularly surprising. Caracalla is very keen to go on campaign. There are stories about him receiving his ration of grain like an ordinary legionary and grinding it on a hand mill, wearing ordinary uniform, all this sort of thing. He thought he was the big butch soldier, and there's that tradition of the Roman commander who lives like an ordinary soldier, who dresses simply. I suppose, Ulysses Grant and people like that, who, again, dress down rather than the fancy uniforms. And there have been others in other periods who've been trying to pick themselves as the soldier. So Caracalla isn't quite the character he is in the film, but by the end of his reign he's becoming increasingly neurotic, suspicious of everybody, and Macrinus, as Praetorian prefect, realised that he's basically on a death list. He's marked for death. The emperor's decided that he's disloyal, even though he probably wasn't at that point. However, he conspires against the emperor, thinking, well, I'm dead anyway, I might as well, the only way to survive is to get rid of him. And Caracalla in reality, which I guess is not something you could do in a film too well, on a journey. He's near Carrhae, where the great disaster had happened to Crassus all those 250 years before, in 217, and on the journey on the road nips behind some bushes to relieve himself, and a centurion from the guard stabs him to death, runs off, gets killed. Macrinus is proclaimed emperor. Macrinus becomes emperor. He doesn't last a full year, but nevertheless the striking thing is that he is accepted by the Senate, but he isn't a senator. He was an equestrian, so he's the first non-senator or non-member of the imperial family, someone from outside the aristocracy of Rome, the first equestrian to ascend to the imperial throne and be accepted, even though, as I say, he doesn't last very long. And then you've got an interesting story. I wonder whether this might come into the Gladiator III. They're talking about whether you get Elagabalus and the claim that he's the illegitimate child of Caracalla and all this sort of thing, and then Severus Alexander. There's even a Severus who crops up as a usurper around about that time in Syria, at least according to the Historia Augusta, which, okay, that's not the most reliable source. But nevertheless, there are options if they're going down the historical route. They've already jumped, they've had things happening 17 years before all this goes on anyway. Macrinus in the story is rather different. He is an owner and trainer of gladiators, a businessman. He's supposed to be an arms supplier. It's all mentioned fairly briefly. The political aspects of this, I think they've pared down, as they did in the original cinematic Gladiator. I mean, the last time I watched that film, I saw the extended version, which has rather more discussion of the politics. So you get hints of his, he bets with the senator and basically ends up winning them, and estate owning this senator. It's very well done. It's a great performance. It's over the top, but he's charming, he can be sinister, he can be ruthless. He is presented as a slightly mysterious figure. There are some reveals of his story in the film that are not based on reality, so I won't go into those, but basically what he tells you about who he was and the mark he shows and why he's doing things, that's not the case with the real Macrinus. And again, he's presented as not yet the politician. He's only starting to wheedle his way into politics by gaining favour with Caracalla and Geta, and by manipulating other people, using information, finding things out, and then using that to his own advantage, and then turning the brothers against each other. So you build towards something that's, I suppose, within, I wouldn't say a stone's throw, but perhaps a catapult's distant throw, if you're not expecting too much of the sort of things that actually happened. But the film story is fictional, deliberately so. They're just telling a story, and it all happens in the same way that the film Gladiator itself telescopes or shrinks down the 12-year reign of Commodus into a couple of hours on screen, and doesn't give the impression of having taken a very long time, whereas he's in fact on the throne for a long time. Caracalla is emperor for over 6 years. Geta only lasts less than a year, but nevertheless Caracalla is around, even though, again, there are oddities. Caracalla is, of course, the man who famously in 212 will extend Roman citizenship to a very high proportion of the folk within the empire, to anyone who's a citizen of a settled community that's recognised by the Romans. So it's not quite everybody, and obviously there's still slaves, but it's a lot of people. Now, you can see that in several ways. You can see that as the Roman Empire trying to prove that everybody is just becoming Roman. You can see it as benevolent, along the lines of the sort of stuff attributed to Marcus Aurelius in the films, perhaps slightly more than the real Marcus Aurelius. Dio cynically says, well, it's all about taxation. It's just to make people liable to inheritance tax and this sort of thing of Roman citizens that gets paid to the emperor rather than to cities. It has implications for army recruitment. One of the problems, though, is that having been a Roman citizen up until then marked you down as someone of considerable status. And there's one bit in the film where they talk about crucifixion and say, oh, well, that's reserved for, criminals, for Christians, for the humble, the poor. They don't actually say it's reserved for citizens. Now, I know they've already broken that rule in Gladiator, where Russell Crowe's wife and child are crucified and burned. Again, it comes back to this whole merging. It's the influence of the older epics, many of which were based around Christianity. You've got the Ben-Hur, you've got Quo Vadis, you've got the Robe and Demetrius the Gladiator, that sort of thing, where the arena became the place where you did have spectacular executions of criminals, but it tended to be more about the public executions rather than the fights. They've sort of merged the gladiatorial fights and the beast fights and the executions all into one generic form of entertainment. Not quite how it worked. On the other hand, you could argue that there is something very Hollywood about the Roman approach to this, that you try and make a public execution a source of entertainment and a source of, it's a warning to people. It's to tell you bad things happen to people who break the rules. But when you kill people in gruesome ways inspired by myths and, burn them and or have animals do unpleasant things to them, all this sort of thing, that's different from gladiatorial fights. So this reflects a merging of it. So Macrinus, the politics, I don't think the Pedro Pascal character is real in any way, but then the Lucilla character isn't real. There was a daughter of Marcus Aurelius who lives on for a very long time under the Severan dynasty, because Severus creates this ancestry to him. It's completely spurious, but he sort of has himself adopted basically into the Antonine family, so they take the Antoninus name, and the family continue that. So it's Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, so and so, this sort of thing. So all of that's going on, but she's fictional in this shape and form. Her son in the first film, Lucius, all of that's that's all made up for the benefit of for the story to work. It isn't real. These aren't real people. I don't think the Pedro Pascal character is. I didn't recognise the name, but correct me if I'm wrong. And there is some inscription recording a governor or a legion commander of that name that was was it Casio or something? I can't remember now. Anyway, from only a few hours ago I saw it, but it didn't ring a bell. He is, there's hostility between him and Paul Mescal's character during it. It seems slightly shame. You felt they could have done with a bit more screen time together, just from a story point of view. But again, plot didn't allow that. So you have all this intrigue. It builds up. There is a rather bigger finale than you have in Gladiator. That's one of my criticisms of Gladiator as a film, is that you felt you wanted a big battle at the end. You sort of get something a bit like that, though there is a more optimistic ending, even though lots of grim stuff has happened. It's quite visually impressive. Somebody like myself would love to see a big pitched battle done on screen again, but that's just because I like that sort of thing. From the point of view of the story, you've got the Praetorian Guards are seen, the Third Augusta turns up again. Quite nice looking armies. There's one or two brief scenes where you see some chaps riding by with oval shields that look a bit like auxiliary cavalry, but they're not really developed. Basically, nearly everybody is a legionary or a Praetorian. Praetorians have a few more horsemen. They're sort of very black, purple crests. Purple crest probably unlikely, but nevertheless, it's distinctive, but it's closer. As I say, the kit in this is closer to the real stuff than it was in the first movie. You don't have to squint quite so much to look at this, and some of it's quite nice. And there's good contrast, sort of the Red Army and the Black Army that meet afterwards. I think really that's probably all I can say about the plot. The gladiatorial fights, you've got the baboons, a little bit strange. You've got the rhino that you could see in the advert. That's distinctly strange, but I suppose with both baboons and somebody riding a rhino, I think it is extraordinarily improbable that anything like that ever happened. But there's certainly no positive evidence in favour of gladiators riding rhinos and fighting from them, and it strikes me as unlikely, but I suppose theoretically possible. The same would be of the big Naumachia, the naval fight that they do in the Colosseum. Now you can argue about how often the Colosseum itself would be used for this sort of thing, or a special venue created for it. That's certainly the case earlier on. These things are occasional. There's an oddity. It's described as the Battle of Salamis. Then I think it's the Trojans against the Persians rather than the Athenians and the other Greeks against the Persians. But Augustus had staged commemorations and sea fights based on Salamis. It does tend to appear. Caracalla was going off for his eastern expedition. Severus had fought against the Parthians before. So it's the sort of thing they do invoke. You have one ship on either side fighting each other. They filled the water full of sharks. You can see this a bit on the advert. It's, again, I think this is extraordinarily unlikely that they ever put sharks in the Colosseum, but apart from the Ridley Scott, well, were you there, type comment, I suppose it is not absolutely impossible that this ever happened, but I think it extremely unlikely. And if you want to do it for your on-screen battle, well, fair enough, it's spectacular. We don't really know quite how the sea fights work. The descriptions of them are not as detailed as gladiatorial fights, and obviously there's less physical evidence for them. You've got they rake one of the ships and break off the oars. That's quite nice. You've had the warships earlier on that are rowed. There's no suggestion of chains and slaves in that, so that's nice. There is a bit of a sort of Ben-Hur look about it. The warships they have earlier have 2 banks of oars, with at least 2 people rowing the upper bank. I couldn't quite see what the lower bank, whether that was 2 as well. So if it's 2 and 2, I suppose that will make it a quadrireme, a 4. It's hard to know what warships were most common by this period. Back in the days of big battles of the First Punic War, it's the quinquereme, the 5. Now, we reckon the best interpretation of that is that's 3 banks of oars with 2 rowing the top, 2 rowing the middle, and 1 person rowing the bottom one. That's 3 banks on either side, so that's 5. It's a team of 5, like a trireme where you have 3 rows of oars, 1 person rowing each one. This has done it slightly differently. On the other hand, by Actium, Antony's fleet has 10 and 8, some of these bigger ships. The Ptolemies are very keen on big warships, and there is a bit of an arms race for a while. Let's just go big between the successor kingdoms. The thing is, by the time you've got to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the Romans rarely fight mass naval battles at all. When they do fight them, they tend to be against other Roman fleets in a civil war. It's a little unclear just what was your standard warship, if there was such a thing, for the imperial naval units. There wasn't really a separate navy, it's all administratively part of the army. Same command structure. So there might have been a lot of triremes, there might have been ships like this. But anyway, they don't look too bad, it's not perfect. They come in under sail with the main mast up, which is unlikely, though they do then furl the sails because it's too strong for doing what they're doing, and then they start rowing. You probably wouldn't do an attack just by sea on a big city like that. There would probably be land forces as well, but there are certainly cases in the Civil War where this had occurred before then. So again, coming back to the sea fight in the Colosseum, it's very over the top, it's very Hollywood, it's very showbiz, but in some ways there's an element of that in the Roman games. So although probably this sort of thing didn't happen in quite this way, nevertheless, and the later one where the Praetorian Guard get involved in what's going on in the arena as part of the act sort of thing, that, well, there's a couple of times where they do that, that seems unlikely. But okay, this is cinema, this is not a history lesson. So coming back to summing up, I'll do, when the thing's finally out on disc, I dare say I'll do a detailed historical, let's look at all the background to this, what really happened, who these people were, how these things were done, this sort of thing, just as I've done with the original film. But we'll leave that until the discs are available, and by then I think most people who want to see it will have seen it. So as I say, I've tried to steer clear of giving away too much. It's good popcorn entertainment, it's spectacular. I don't know whether it quite has the impact of the first film, because when that came out there hadn't been anything like this, any really epic films, any Roman set films for a very long time. So it was nice to see on the big screen, and you're inevitably comparing this to Russell Crowe in the first one and Oliver Reed and all that. So it doesn't quite have that impact. It reminds me of, I remember being, I was still just finishing my doctorate when they announced that they were making new Star Wars films, and it would be the prequels, the Phantom Menace and all that came out. And I was excited, lots of friends were, and then rather disappointed when they came out. And I think one of the main reasons for the disappointment, apart from anything else, is that just releasing those films didn't bring back our childhood and didn't have the impact of the original trilogy. And there's a little bit of that with this, is that Gladiator, when it came out, it was, wow, I haven't seen anything like this in the cinema for a long time. We're all getting far more blasé about special effects, grand spectacle, casts of thousands, this sort of thing. So even though this does stuff well, and I think Russell Crowe's performance in the original has become sort of fairly iconic, we've got used to it, and if you're British and ever listen to Radio 4 on the comedy programme Dead Ringers, the impressionist, he was lampooned a lot with various stuff. So you get used to that, you know, I shall have my revenge in this life or the next stuff. This film will take time to get to that sort of status and that sort of familiarity. So it didn't quite have the same impact I remember the original one had, but I think people will be more comfortable with the historical inaccuracies in this one, or the historical liberties, shall we say, let's be charitable, that have been taken compared to Napoleon, where more people, I think, are more familiar with the basics of Napoleon's career. And this is an action film, whereas the Napoleon was more supposed to be character and about the relationship with Josephine, and because they changed so much with that, because Joaquin Phoenix couldn't really age in it, it didn't work in quite the same way as a film. This works better as a film. It's not Shakespeare, you know, it's not deeply profound. It's spectacular, it's grand, there's lots of action. You sympathise with the leads, you want them to win, you're on their side. It works very well. Denzil Washington's, you know, I think steals the show a lot of the time. And it's a nice, it's a view of, it's a stereotype cartoony Rome, but it's a recognisable Rome with some nice bits where the detail. They talk earlier on when they're getting near Rome with the stink. That's a nice touch. They show the beggars, this sort of thing. It's a slightly grubbier. It's also, whilst there's lots of tomato ketchup flying around and bits being chopped off and this sort of thing, it's not heavy on sex scenes or that sort of thing, or bad language. Other than the violence, actually, this is quite close to an old-fashioned historical epic that you could put on a Sunday afternoon on a bank holiday on British television, which is how, you know, I grew up seeing most of these things. But this is a bit too gory for that. But in other respects, there aren't really those sorts of themes. It simplifies, distorts Roman history, but, you know, it isn't there to do that. This is an adventure story with a Roman setting, and it does that pretty well. I think it's entertaining. It's probably a bloke's film. There's not a lot of romance or emotion in this, other than emotion of something terrible and I want my revenge, or I'm deciding to do something better. But again, why not? You know, it is very much, I think, an action movie with a historical setting, with a grand scape, and it does have those moments of grandeur. I mean, any Ridley Scott film, there are always those scenes where they're visually so powerful, so striking, and even if you don't like how he's doing things, it looks good. And this one does look good, and as I say, it's a bit lighter in terms of its tones of colours than the other one. It sometimes feels a bit rushed plot-wise, even though it's, 2.5 hours, something like that. It's getting to the point where, when you're middle-aged like me, you're starting to wish there was an interval. But it's, you know, it's not too long. It doesn't feel ponderous. A lot of things happen quite quickly when they do happen. Some of the character development is quite rapid. You know, it seems to sort of flick like that. Maybe the other one, the old one, was a little bit like that. The thing is, a sequel is always problematic because you're expecting something like the original. You want the same thrills, the same enjoyment you had with the original, just more of it and slightly different, but not too different that it isn't a sequel to the film. So I think it does all of those things, but has the same problems that inevitably a sequel has. So I'd be curious to know what happens if they do make a third film. You know, Ridley Scott's not the youngest fellow around these days, but still seems to have this remarkable energy for making movies. So who knows? It might, a couple of years, it might be out. Where they go historically from here, I don't know. But given that they're sort of doing their own, I don't know, it's like a Marvel thing where they just keep having their own universe and we'll do this series of films in this. It's a bit like that. It's not the historical one very closely in terms of what's going on and dates and personalities and this sort of thing, but I suppose Elagabalus on screen as a, you know, a completely barking teenage dancing emperor who's you know, goodness knows what, I'm not sure of the terminology, but dresses as a woman, talks about getting a sex change, all this sort of thing, but also marries several times, is clearly a complicated youth who is not a terribly good emperor. That's obviously got potential, but whether that would be too ridiculous, whether the audience would just say, well, we can't accept this. Severus Alexander, some of the others are getting to the Gordians, people like that. And whether you're always keeping, you know, can the Paul Mescal character or some equivalent to still perform the Russell Crowe, let's go back and be a gladiator and fight in the arena. Because it's very much arena focused, even though you have the bits outside. So Gladiator II, I'd say it does what it says on the tin, really. It's an adventure film. It's historical flavour, historical setting and background rather than history. It's not about the real events, it's not about the politics, it's not really about how Roman society and the Roman Empire worked, and there are aspects that I'll talk about more when I, in months to come, do a longer video on the thing itself, where they portray the Roman Empire in ways that just don't really work for this period. But it's fun. It's recognisably Roman. I prefer... I mean, I still feel this about the Napoleon film. I know, and from lots of the comments, people just hate that with a deep and bitter loathing, but I'd still prefer, at least we had that compared to nothing. I'd prefer to have a more historically accurate, convincing, detailed film, a sort of, you know, film like the movie Gettysburg, but about the Waterloo campaign, or Leipzig, or Borodino, or Austerlitz even, or anything like that. That would be fabulous. I would love to see that, but whether that is commercially viable is another matter, whether there's anyone out there who's going to make that sort of thing. And I would have liked a more detailed thing about Napoleon and his marshals and all of that, but that's not what we got. But it was nice to see some of the uniforms were decent enough, too many flags and sometimes the wrong flags, the battles a bit stylized, shall we say, to be polite. This is the same sort of thing, and even though I'm a Romanist and probably more familiar with this period, even though I'm a big Napoleonic nut as well, I could switch off and enjoy that. It's something I've learned. I think it started with the Oliver Stone Alexander movie, where I just decided after this I would switch off my historian's brain when I go and see these things. Watch them for the spectacle, the grandeur, the big scenes, the epic feel, because I do like epic stuff, and then be pleased when there's a few things where you think, okay, that's not too bad, or at least I can see what they're trying there, that's a good idea. This is far less trying to be detailed historically. This is all about adventure, excitement, thrills, spectacle, and those it delivers. So I'm glad they're making films like this, and I'm a fan of Ridley Scott because apart from, you know, some of the films I think are really good, and you know, anyone who does like the Napoleonic period will probably sigh and think back to the Duelists, just because of the details of Hussar uniform and all that, and the feel of the thing, the sword fights, that it's just a very nice, quite small-scale short film. I think it was his first one. He's made more historically set films than anybody else in the last couple of decades, and yes, they take immense liberties with the history, but I'm just glad that somebody's doing this stuff, and that actually sometimes they get some things just about right, or close enough. You know, there's some. It's like the Robin Hood film with Russell Crowe in, where some of the knights have painted helmets. You know, that was quite nice. Hadn't seen that before. I don't think anyone had done that before. So they sometimes get this. It's like my Third Augusta Legion with their red shields in this, looking a bit brighter, and the Centurions looking the part. You know, there's some bits where you think, oh yeah, okay, I like that. It's not bad at all. So, and I'm glad that we've got films about the past, we've got historically set ones, we've got action films, because I like that sort of thing. You get some battle scenes, you get some fight scenes, I like that sort of stuff. I can't protest about the goriness, because I've put that in my novels, just thinking, well, if people are laying around each other with swords, then it's going to be messy, and you don't want to glamorize it and make it too clean and too pristine. So, worth a look, enjoyable. I'm not sure whether it'll gain quite the same fan base as the original one, because, as I say, it's just always hard to be a sequel. I have no idea where they'll go with the third film, should it get made. I know they're talking about it, but I hope they do. And it gets people interested. I've met so many people over the years who become really keen on the Romans, on ancient history, because of Gladiator, because they saw that in the cinema and something flicked in their head and they just, oh yeah, that's interesting, I'd like to know more. And that's good for people like me, because they might read their books, but it's how we all start. Asterix books and epic films on television and local archaeology had a lot to do with me developing an interest and becoming so fascinated by the past in general, the Romans in particular, that all these decades on, I'm still fascinated by it. I'm still intrigued. I still want to know more. So all of these things, I think they're good for ancient history, for the interest in the classical world, interest in archaeology, interest in the Roman army, all of these sorts of things. Even if you do have to spend a lot of your life talking to friends and saying, well, that didn't actually happen, what they really did was this, or it didn't look like that, all that sort of thing. Nevertheless, at least you're talking about it. It's better than it just being forgotten and nobody knowing, because there's not much in the state education, in the standard education now, that gives people much sense of the classical past. One slightly weird thing coming in that there's a quote from the Aeneid in the story, but it's quite nice. But then you see this, and you see another quote later on in inscriptions on the wall, but they're in English. And I thought that was an interesting decision, because in the past they've always gone, everything's Latin, or whatever it should be. And perhaps the character translates it. They use Ve Victis, woe to the defeated, quite a few times in this film. That slightly surprised me. I thought, oh, that's odd. Again, fair enough if that's what they want to do. After all, your characters are speaking English that's supposed to be Latin. I mean, there's a nice Denzil Washington line where he's talking to Paul Mescal, and what language do you speak? And I think it's something like, I speak all of them, or I know all of them, which is quite nice for the character, and that sense of there are lots of different languages within the empire. But anyway, that was just one of those peculiarities. But anyway, I've no idea, because I haven't planned this. I've just been rambling away, having come back and sorted myself out after an afternoon's trip to the cinema. But Gladiator II, I think it's worth a look if you're interested in the ancient world, but as long as you like adventure films and you don't expect too much in the way of serious history, political intrigue. It's there, but it's at one remove. It's to get the plot moving, and it's for a 2.5-hour film, it actually flows, the story flows pretty quickly, and quite a lot happens. So, in fact, sometimes to the point where you think, actually, wow, that change has come in rather faster than I expected. So it isn't dull, it's exciting, it's spectacular. Every now and again there are things you think aren't too bad and are maybe right. But it's worth a look. But as I say, I won't say any more, because I don't want to spoil the twists and turns and the way the plot develops. Plausibility-wise, it reminds me, as I said at the start, of a lot of Greek and Latin novels, in that it stretches credulity at times, but it's in its own world, on its own terms. It works, and that's all it needs to do, surely. So I think it's good. I'm glad they've made it. I'm glad they've released it. It's nice seeing a Roman film in the cinemas again. And there's talk, I think Russell Crowe's supposed to be making a film called The Last Druid or something like that, that'll be set in Caledonia, he'll be among the tribes fighting the Romans. Now, whilst obviously, as the author of the wonderful Vindolanda series and the sequels, The Fort, The City, and the Wall, then they should have adapted those stories, because those are far better, and Flavius Ferox is crying out to be on the screen. However, I'll be quite happy to see another epic film, and Russell Crowe's usually worth the money, so it'll be interesting. And I would like there to be a good film that really portrays tribes in Britain, Iron Age tribes, well, goes beyond the sort of, the way they've turned Vikings into bikers, basically, with swords, creates a good Celtic look, for want of a better term, that actually looks convincing and doesn't look as if they're all actors that have spent all their lives indoors. Develops that sense in the same way, more recent Westerns or things like The Last of the Mohicans, for all the liberties, again, they take with history, they gave you a good feel of the tribes and the warriors that look impressive. They can look scary, and they look convincing, as if these are people who maybe did live this outdoor life and hunted and survived that way and fought. So it'd be nice if that can happen. That'll be interesting. I don't know at what stage that's in. I just have read the odd thing about that. So we'll see how it goes. But anyway, Gladiator 2 is out there now, and when it finally comes around to it and I've watched the thing more than once and it's come out on disc, I'll do a much more detailed history of the times. Septimius, Severus, Caracalla and Geta, Macrinus, all of these people. But for the moment, that's it for today. So thanks for watching.